the really worrying thing to me about the recent story with Delta, even before Omicron, as it relates to all this, is it really does seem, especially in the US, but in a lot of countries in Western Europe too, even with relatively high vaccination rates, we still have enough unvaccinated people that we can have some large scale dying. And, the US is really remarkable here. I wrote a piece about it last week, but, if you look at the ratio of cases to hospitalizations and deaths from America's Delta surge, so basically in September and October of this year, if you took X many cases, how many people would you expect would be hospitalized and how many people would you expect would die? That ratio is actually unchanged from the pre-vaccine winter surge of January and February 2021. So given the same number of, there are somewhat fewer cases. We're talking about an average of about 100 to 150 thousand cases a day, as opposed to 200 to 250,000 new cases. But given the same number of cases, you're seeing as many severe outcomes, which means overall, you know, basically the vaccines in Delta fought to a draw. At the national level, the new variant and the vaccines, and we ended up in exactly the same place. And now we're on the downslope of Delta, but we're at flat.
Exactly the
Yeah,
same
sorry.
place, meaning we're exactly back where were before we had any vaccines? Is that what you mean?
The death rate of American cases is where it was before we had any vaccines. And the hospitalization rate is in fact higher than it was, given the same number of cases than it was before we had vaccines. This is something that I've been worrying over, talking to people about, asking for explanations about for a few months now. I had a long interview with the Dr. Eric Topol in late August, just as Delta was about to take off, and we were looking at this very early data for Delta, and I was saying, I just don't understand. We're talking about 80% of America's senior population has been vaccinated. We know that the vast majority of the country's mortality risk is concentrated in that group among America's seniors. And the age skew is so dramatic. It's an 80-year-old has 10,000 times the mortality risk as a 10-year-old, and hundreds of times the risk of someone in their 70s or 60s anyway. That you would expect that if we got 80% of the America's seniors vaccinated, that would mean that no matter how big a wave hit us, we would see death that was only 10%, 20% of what we had seen before vaccination. And that's what we saw in the UK's Delta wave. They have higher vaccination rates than we do, but they had huge case growth, pretty small growth in death and hospitalization. In the US, it just didn't happen. In the US, we had a somewhat smaller spike of cases than we had the previous winter, which was the worst period in the pandemic. But again, given the same number of cases, the ratio of cases to hospitalizations and cases to deaths didn't improve at all. So when we talk about, vaccines protecting individuals from getting it maybe by a factor of 5 or something, and protecting you against severe illness by a factor of 10 or 12, it seems like basically Delta, at least in the US, counteracted those forces. And we had enough unvaccinated people that we produced the same death toll from the same number of cases. And I honestly don't feel like I understand it. And I've been asking doctors and epidemiologists for months about it, and I don't feel myself like I really understand what's going on, or that I've gotten an answer from anyone else who felt super confident about what was going on. But I think, among other things, it probably means that Delta turns out to have been considerably more virulent and pathogenic, not just more transmissible.